On August the 23rd, 1936, one of America's most fascinating serial killers was born. Over the span of his life, the press would give him numerous nicknames, such as the One-Eyed Drifter, the Confession Killer, and the Highway Stalker. His name was Henry Lee Lucas. Depending on who you believe, he could have been responsible for as few as 3 murders, or as many as thousands. He was notorious for openly confessing to a multitude of murders committed in a diverse number of ways. However, today many people believe that many of his confessions were false. And thanks to police error, it's virtually impossible to know how many murders he confessed to were actually carried out by him, and how many of his confessions were just lies. To add to some of the confusion, he also befriended and supposedly murdered alongside another serial killer famous for making false confessions. His name was Otis Toole. Otis Toole is the man many believe was responsible for killing Adam Walsh, the son of America's Most Wanted host, John Walsh. To understand how Lucas was shaped by his environment into the monster he became, it's important to go back to his childhood. He grew up in a tiny 2-room log cabin with dirt floors in rural Virginia. He had 8 brothers and sisters, but many were being raised by other relatives. Unfortunately, he was not one of them. He wasn't considered bright, and he repeated first grade 3 times. His family was staggeringly dirt poor. His mother, Viola, according to him, was an extremely cruel and twisted individual. A sex worker, she often forced him to watch her have sex with her clients. She would supposedly dress him up as a girl when they went out in public, and before he went to school, in the hopes he would become a prostitute himself, who could entice both male and female clients. When he was 7, she picked up a 2x4 and bashed the back of his head so hard he went into a coma. When he was 10 years old, he got into a knife fight with a brother and his left eye became severely infected. His mother ignored it. The infection got worse and eventually his left eye had to be removed. It was replaced with a glass eye that Lucas would sometimes take out of its socket to shock and frighten his classmates. This would later result in Lucas receiving the nickname the One-Eyed Drifter. Lucas's father, Anderson, was a double amputee. Tragically, he lost both of his legs in a railroad accident, and the neighbours spread cruel gossip about him. They said he purposely laid on the tracks and let the train run over his legs in order to collect disability funds. Anderson was beaten by not only his wife, but also her lover and her pimp. When Henry Lee Lucas was 13 years old, his father may have died coming home from a pub during a snowstorm. He drunkenly collapsed outside and died from the resulting hypothermia or possibly pneumonia. It is unclear. A well-known rumour at the time, however, states that Lucas's father purposely dragged himself from the house to die out in the cold. The Montgomery News Messenger reported the following about the misfortune. It is not clear when the father died of pneumonia, but his passing was reportedly hastened by his wife. According to some sources, it was around this time that Lucas began to commit bestiality after being taught how to rape, torture and mutilate animals by one of his mother's lovers. He may have also begun having sex with one of his half-brothers. It was not too long afterwards that Henry Lee Lucas decided to run away from home. He wandered around Virginia for a couple of years until he allegedly committed his first murder at the age of 14 or 15. Killing became the same thing as having sex, Henry Lee Lucas would go on to say. According to a confession that he would later recant, Lucas met 17-year-old Laura Burnsley in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1951. He drove her to a quiet, secluded spot, and when she refused to have sex with him, he strangled her and disposed of her body in the woods without a second thought. Like many of the murders he would later confess to, her disappearance went unsolved for years. It is unclear if Lucas actually killed her or if the police took their desire to tie up the case a little too far. In any case, if Henry Lee Lucas really did kill her, he got away with it scot-free, but was imprisoned in June 1954 for numerous robberies he took part in. It boggles the mind, but somehow he managed to escape his prison in 1957, though he was recaptured in a matter of days. During his time behind bars, he wrote to and befriended a pen pal that he would later become engaged to. In 1959, at the age of 23, Henry Lee Lucas was officially released and went to live with his half-sister Opal in Michigan. He was excited to start a new life with his fiancée, the pen pal, and it's intriguing to wonder what would have happened had his mother never travelled to Michigan too. Would he have married this woman he exchanged letters with in prison? Would he have killed her? Instead, Henry Lee Lucas's mother decided to visit him and Opal, and fate played out very differently. Viola loathed the idea of her son marrying a woman he didn't really know, and badgered him about it constantly. She threw fits and demanded he move back to Blacksburg to care for her instead. Considering their relationship, he naturally refused her requests. During one such argument, she supposedly grabbed a broom and personally struck him over the head. He claims it was self-defense when he stabbed her in the neck. A quote from Henry Lee Lucas: "All I remember was slapping her alongside the neck, but after I did that, I saw her fall and decided to grab her. But she fell to the floor, and when I went back to pick her up, I realized she was dead. Then I noticed that I had my knife in my hand and she had been cut." He was already fleeing to Virginia when his half-sister Opal came home and found their mother in a pool of blood. In fact, still alive according to some sources. She called 911, but their mother was already too far gone. The coroner ruled that Viola's official cause of death was a heart attack triggered by the attack. In court, he would argue he was acting in self-defense, but the jurors didn't buy it. Lucas would claim later to have raped his mother's corpse after watching her bleed out, but would later backtrack, saying he made that up. Henry Lee Lucas is a violent example of the US prison system's failing. Though he was caught, charged and sentenced for the 20 to 40 years of imprisonment, and though he reportedly told his prison guards it would be a bad idea to release him, he was out of prison after only 10 years due to prison overcrowding. Only a year and a half later, he was caught attempting to kidnap 3 schoolgirls. He went back behind bars, this time for 5 years, and once more became engaged to one of his prison pen pals. She was the widow of one of his cousins. Elizabeth Betty Crawford would marry Henry Lee Lucas in December 1975. Their brief 2-year marriage would end when it became clear that Lucas was sexually abusing his stepdaughters. Lucas would later tell the police that it was during this time that he also began frequently driving around, picking up and murdering hitchhikers. Though how he would have hidden this from his new family is unclear. What is clear is that he got a taste for murder. At some point in 1976, Lucas met Otis Toole in a soup kitchen. Toole was already a suspect in several murder cases and a serial arsonist. He and Lucas shared similarly difficult childhoods. Toole claimed to have killed his first victim at the age of 14, whereas Lucas supposedly started his career as a murderer around the age of 15. The two quickly formed a friendship and became lovers. Whether or not they actually travelled together killing the unfortunate souls they had come across is unclear. It is known that in prison years later, Toole would boast of assisting Lucas with 108 murders, many of which he claimed were for a cult named the Hands of Death. The police repeatedly denied was real. Toole once described Lucas as a sort of mentor to him, teaching him the finer ways of attracting and killing victims. Lucas would go on to move in with Toole's parents and to form an uncountably close association with Toole's younger niece. Frida Becky Powell was just a child when she met Lucas, and she had a mild intellectual impairment. In 1982, at the age of 15, she lost both her mother and her grandmother, and she was moved to a state shelter. While there, Henry Lee Lucas convinced her to run away with him and travel the country. There's been some speculation that he may have used her to attract victims by having her act sick or scared, the same way Ted Bundy would trick victims by pretending to be injured or disabled. They eventually got a job looking after an elderly woman named Kate Rich in Ringgold, Texas, but they were quickly kicked out by the elderly woman for stealing money from her and not doing their job. They then hitchhiked to Stoneburg, Texas, with a minister of a commune called the House of Prayer, who offered the couple housing and work. Around this time, Becky began to argue with Lucas. She wanted to return to Florida, but Lucas wouldn't let her. Though before dying, Lucas would later deny killing anyone besides his mother. Law enforcement strongly believe Lucas then killed Becky before returning to Ringgold and killing the elderly Kate Rich. Becky was only 15 at the time. Henry Lee Lucas would later lead police to where he claimed to have buried them, and police did indeed find 2 bodies. But forensics was inconclusive as to who the bodies belonged to. The police quickly listed Lucas as the prime suspect in the murder of Kate Rich. In June 1983, he was caught with an illegal firearm by a Texas Ranger, and it is while in prison for this crime that he confessed to the murder of Kate Rich and Becky Powell. He then began to confess to more killings, and more. Police set up a task force to investigate these crimes, and Henry Lee Lucas received innumerable rewards for his cooperation. Unlike other prisoners, he was allowed to leave prison to eat in restaurants and cafes and roam around police stations unchecked. The task force determined he was responsible for 213 unsolved murders, and he was eventually convicted of 11 homicides. He was sentenced to death for the murder of one Jane Doe, the girl famously known as the girl with the orange socks. but this was later commuted to life in prison. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that Henry Lee Lucas lied about many of his confessions. However, there is also plenty of evidence to back many of them up. How many people did Henry Lee Lucas actually kill? Was he actually the most successful serial killer to roam the US, as many people still believe? Or was he only responsible for the death of his mother, as Henry Lee Lucas would himself later claim? This will likely forever remain a mystery, as Henry Lee Lucas died in his prison cell in 2001 from a heart failure at the age of 64. His grave remains unlisted and unmarked to avoid vandalism.